All right, what I want to show you here is if you look on the server under shared group content, as mentioned earlier in the class, I'm going to share this stuff. Now, what I would not do at all right now is I would not try to open this and set up Premiere and click around click for click with me. That will not be a good way to learn today. I would take some notes on the process of what we're going to do. And then, like I said, I'll try to spend 20 minutes maybe on this, and then we're going to go to the lab and actually do it because I think you guys just need to do it. So if you take a look at your assignment in front of you, the sheet that I handed out, I'm going to have two things that I want you to complete. One is going to be a color correction of a little office shot that I've set up. And actually, this is what I have set in front of me. I literally just took my camera and I put it out of whack on the white balance. And it was pretty seriously off base when comparing the two shots. Now, I've done some correction on this. This was from last class, the one that's up on the board. But basically, I'm going to have you go through and just correct two shots from a white balance standpoint. And if you do that well with this, you'll find that a lot of it's going to transfer over to your own stuff. So part two of this is I want you to basically use your own material, your own footage from the camera color calibration sort of exercise we did where you took 3-4 different cameras, shot a sequence on it, and tried to blend that footage because you're going to find that it's not all perfect. So ideally your sequence is already done as expected, and now you can just move on to color correction with it. So if not, if for some reason you weren't at that, I put in some other material. I took this from a past example. This is an example of a group that they white balanced their cameras and then they put on neutral density filters after white balancing it. And a couple of them had like some $5 neutral density filters that they got off of Amazon. Other ones had a little more expensive glass ones. Well, that's the downside of the cheapies is they can put color cast in your image. So we take a look at these three shots. Like this one's getting sort of close to normal. This one is pretty far off, as well as this third one. So they've got color cast all over the place on them. So that'll be my challenge. If you can somehow get through yours today and you want to fix that one. That's one of the most difficult ones I've had come through my group. All right. So that said, what I'm going to start out with is when we go with it, you can just copy these files. So the color correction demo, copy that, put that in your own individual folder. That's where I'm going to go look at it and see that you got it done. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to kind of start out with a couple of things. So if you look up on the board here, I have kind of order of operations that I typically work in, that most people typically work in. And I would suggest looking at this workflow. I would suggest before you ever start kind of clicking around and messing with color or levels or anything, you got an idea of kind of how it works. So what I'm going to bring up first is we're going to take a look at shadow, midtone, highlight, probably terms you guys have heard from your photo courses, maybe other courses, maybe anything where you've had to work with photo manipulation or imagery. And I'm going to bring up something. So this tab is not by default always up. Depends the mode that you're working in. So you notice that Premiere has everything kind of ganged up for task. So you've got like an assembly task. This speaks to sort of the linear workflow thing we just talked about. You're going to take in ingest media. Well, you need to maybe isolate, tag it all with or log it all by putting names on it. Isolate your choices. This workspace is set up for that. Editing moves everything around for more typical editing workflows. And color, where I'm in today, is going to give you a couple of things. One, it's going to give you the lumetri control on the right, which is just an effect, basically. It's just that it's applied, it's given its own window by default, as opposed to other effects where you have to go down to the effects menu and dig through it and look at what effects you might want to apply. This just kind of gangs it up. You may also see Lumetri Scopes as a tab. And this is another great reason to go to the lab, because if anybody has Premiere up on their machine, I bet you Lumetri Scopes or half of these are hidden in some collapsed menu, because it's the downside of trying to edit on 13-inch laptops. It's just really, really hard. So if you've never edited or worked on a larger interface, you're going to fall in love with it. And that's what we're going to do in the lab today, is work on big interfaces. So when I bring this up, if you don't see that, that's under window. In fact, everything that I'm going to reference here today is under window typically. So if I need to find my Lumetri scopes, just a video scope, that's going to be applied under the window. So I brought that up. Video scopes are tools that you can use on monitors in the field. Some video cameras have them built into the system memory, or essentially the BIOS, the operating system of the camera. So they're built in on more advanced video cameras. Or again, if you have an external monitor, they're also review features in most post-production suites. So not just Premiere, you can learn this stuff about color and seeing color and working with it. It applies to all sorts of other things. I mean, I basically taught myself DaVinci Resolve, which is a pretty complex software, and but I'd worked with Magic Bullet's Colorista 2 before that. I worked with Apple's color corrector. I'd worked with Premiere's color corrector. I think even all the way back to a Media 100 system a long time ago that I worked on. So if you learn color, it kind of translates to other things. So that said, we're going to look at two things. I'm going to right click on this, my mouse, to pick a couple different ones. And I've got the waveform up on the right, and I have the RGB parade on my left. I'm going to start with just the waveform by closing the RGB parade and see what all this means. All right, so what this represents, and you know, it maybe kind of looks like histogram a little bit for those of you familiar with histogram from your camera settings, but this is a video dedicated scope, and this runs in what you would call IRE values. So those IRE scales, somebody can Google it because I always forget the last part. I think it's International Radio Telephone Operators Guild or something like that. It's a standard from the past that came up with the name. But basically, 0 IRE is effectively no pixels on in your RGB color space. Basically, that is no data. So that's not like shadows. Shadows to me are dark areas of image that maybe you can still pick up some semblance of detail. You know, the pitch black of night where we see nothing would be a good example of 0 IRE. Or a studio shot where you've put the camera so far away from maybe a dark backdrop that it just goes to pitch black, and you're doing that for effect on the piece. That's 0 IRE. The other side of the scale at the top, 100 IRE is basically totally overexposed. And knowing what those are can tell you some things about your image. So I'll show you what I mean. I'm going to go to the project here, and I have exposure adjust samples, and I have two of them. So one of them here is this key, and then I have the next key that's been overexposed. And let's kind of look at it, because we've talked about the concept of highlight preservation. I think this is a pretty good example. So with this in my timeline, I'm going to go to my Lumetri scope and take a look at it. This is an example of something where I've underexposed enough that I have a lot of the image kind of go to black at the bottom of it. So we're kind of not really going too far above the 30 IRE on the scale, the very bottom of it. Let's switch to the other one that's overexposed. So I'll jump to it. So just a car key laying on my office desk. This is a good example of some pretty clipped stuff, as in it pushes totally to 100 IRE. It means that you're not necessarily going to be able to pull any of that data back that's up in this region. So where it all hits flat, I'll show you what I mean. I'm going to go over to the the Lumetri color control on the right-hand side over here. And the way Lumetri works first is if I click on it and I make a change, this is like an effect that shows up with your clip. So just before I click it, if I double-click this clip as an example, here's my key in the source window, as in it's seeing the file from the perspective of how it looks, you know, over here in my project window. This is the clips display from the project window. It's unaltered. I can alter it in my timeline. What I see in source is going to stay the same. That source clip, double click it here, is going to have an effect control. The effect controls show what's going on in the timeline, the effect controls tab. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to go into Lumetri under basic correction, and I'm going to see if I can adjust the exposure to maybe pull back some of that highlight detail. So I'll pull it way back. I'll take the exposure down. Maybe I'll try to go into the highlights and pull the highlights back to see if I can get more out of it. Maybe the whites as well, although I don't have a lot of white stuff in that scene. But I'm going to see if I can get whatever I can out of it. And it's little, so I don't know if you could see it, but this was not there before. In my clips effect control up at the top, now I've got Lumetri there. So it's just automatically applying that effect the second I click anything in the Lumetri window. And what we can get into with grading is we can actually use multiple instances of color correctors and stack them on top of each other and mask them and isolate them and control them. But we're not going to do that until next time. We're going to start basic. You should be able to take a single instance of Lumetri and correct what you need to today. But I want to take a look at the vector scope, or sorry, the waveform, and show you what we did here. So here's the waveform after my adjustments. Sorry, screen's goofing up a little bit. Let's see if that freshens it up. There we go. All right. Here's my waveform after adjustment. You notice how I pull it down and it's still flatline all the top? You guys see that? It's basically telling me, hey, you know what? You can pull that down all you want, but you're never going to get any of that data back. There's no latitude to it. So this is why when you guys are shooting with these DSLR cameras, I say, you know, if you're in a scenario where the exposure is hairy, back it off a half stop, back it off a stop. I just did this past weekend shooting out on the ice for about 9 hours on Saturday. Awesome day to shoot though. It was warm out, overcast, it worked great. But there's a lot of light out there. You got to watch that. Shooting with snow, we saw so much of that in here, problems with snow. And I'll tell you what, it can be done. You just got to watch your exposures. So it's a great example of why you should bracket your stuff. This is overexposed. This is more underexposed, but you know what? I can live with this. I could go in and play with the base leveling on this to at least bring some detail out of it. Worst case, it's going to get a little bit grainy, but at least it doesn't look totally out of the exposure range. And as you can see, when I play this back, there has been a little bit of grain added. Let me go back here. If I can figure out where I am. But my exposure looks a little bit better. All right, so let's take a look at this. I'm going to go back to the file that I started with for reference. And we're going to end up using waveform to look at a little bit, but then I'm primarily going to move into working with the RGB parade. There's a lot of scopes you can bring up, but I think if you can learn RGB parade and maybe waveform secondarily, you can jump into almost any color correction application or color correction suite. So what I'm going to take are the white balance cuts. So here I had two shots, and I just kind of put this in my office and I pushed a camera in on it. So I'll make a little cut, set in and out on it, pop it down in my timeline. I'll kind of pick a point to blend it in with since it's moving. I'll have it moving too, I guess. And this stability bothers me, but maybe I could stabilize that afterward with a video effect here. But let's take this as reference. So sort of order of operations. You're going to have a bunch of clips. And what I would do personally, and this is the way that I do it, is I start looking at which clip in a sequence looks the most normal. So at the beginning, we took a look through these few shots that I said was one of the most out of whack color balance shots I'd ever had out of a section. I would say that of the three that I looked at, this one kind of like looked the best as a starting point. I still don't think that it's perfect. There's some odd kind of colors going on there. The white, for example, in her shirt looks almost yellow, and that was a white shirt. I know that day it was much more of a bright white shirt. So I can tell that there's color casts kind of all over the place. But I'd at least isolate one clip that sort of looks the most normal, get that maybe corrected, and then use it like an anchor or kind of a node point around which to correct everything else. The reason I say that is I see students get kind of caught up in an echo chamber a lot, and don't get me wrong, because I was totally like as much as possible a sandbox kid growing up, as in I like to click and do things and see what happens. That's kind of the beauty of computers, is it's not destructive like we're making a physical cut on film. We're not like committing a whole bunch of money into it. We can play around. Um, but the problem is, if you start messing with clips and sequence down the timeline, you're going to find that every little change you make down the timeline kind of affects everything else before it. Has anyone ever been stuck in this scenario before, whether it's with video or design or layout or anything like that? Getting into a kind of your own feedback cycle. I've done that. So when I look at these two, I'm going to take a look at them. So I have this first shot, pushing in, and then I have this second shot. Which one looks more correct to your eye? What's that? One? First one? Sorry, I'm wearing these things. There we go. Let's do this. There, that's better. Yeah, I'd agree that, hold on, that's not going to work. I'd agree. The first one looks closer. I don't know that the close one's, that it's perfect. By eye, what would you say are the characteristics of the image? Does it have tonal cast to it? Does it look right? Again, you might have to know the environment. It's my office. I like to call it solitary confinement. But does the image have a quality to it at all? Could you describe the color cast? Does it have a color cast to it? Does it look correct? Incorrect? Looks more correct? Well, it looks more correct when compared with this one. This one I would describe as being warmer, for sure. Has some issues. That maybe needs to be adjusted, this one. But this one I think has a couple other issues with it. Is there anything that stands out in color or exposure values? All right. So Taylor, you said it looks a little bit overexposed. Why are you saying that? Like, there's something on there. I don't know. I'm so upset about the chair, but to me, it's key stuff. It's the highlights that are getting pushed in it. If you go take a look in, like if I switched my view to 400% in my viewfinder and went in and took a look at what I have here, if it'll react, there we go. Stuff like details on the paper, the notes, they're getting lost. There's a poster on the wall as well up here, where some of this content's getting crushed out a little bit in the whites. We're just losing it. So yeah, I'd say it's a little bit overexposed. Let me know if it's just me here. But I also feel that the wood itself, like in the table, does it look a little green? Or is it just me? Am I just seeing what I want? Brady's like, come on, I know something you don't. The rest of the class doesn't. Maybe he does. Brady, I'm going to pick on Brady because he's in my 141 class. What's my problem? Deuton. Yeah, I'm mild red-green deuton deficient, supposedly. So my doctor told me that when I was like 9 or something, because I had to get checked up, because I think I got hit in the face with a rock or something on the playground, and I had to go get that checked out, and take the eye test. Does anybody in here have that? I'm just kind of curious. Yo, you got a little bit of that? Is it bad or can you manage? Yeah, you'll find that that's say no, Nate, you're GD major, right? You know what? I have had it basically my whole life, supposedly. I failed those about, a handful of Ishihara tests. We did 27 plates in my other class the other day, and I think I failed like 5 or 6. It was quite a few. But you know what? I've never had anybody question my color and say everything you're doing looks really blue or really red. I've never had that problem, so it's manageable. But part of it is I need to check myself a little bit and use the tools, but at the same time, I'd argue that anyone can balance from the tools. So some people have kind of what was called a golden eye, as in they can just like perceive and see color really, really well. We could get into long conversations on that. But almost anybody working in the color world typically uses tools to back it up. So one of them that I showed was the waveform already. So I'm going to jump over to Lumetri scopes. My waveform can be an indicator. You'll notice that there's basically red, green, and blue in there, and it overlaps and comes together at some points. I'm going to go away from this and separate the channels out. So I'm going to put on the RGB parade and turn off the waveform. And this can be really, really useful for looking at specific parts of images. Now, so what we have there is basically a left to right display. There's specific parts of the image that you can sometimes pick up on it based on the color. Like somebody had shots with fingernails in it the other day, and we could see they were bright red fingernails, and you could completely see the shape of the fingernails in the parade scope. But basically, you're going to have, I'll pop this over here. Basically, you're going to have points of alignment. So if you look at this, like, are there any points in these that stick out across red, green, and blue? Like identifiable shapes or marks? I have people come up with all sorts of fun. Somebody called this the reverse Italy boot yesterday. Do you see it in all three spots? I see it here. Let me use the mouse. I see it here. I see it here. And I see it here, only in a different spot. Do you guys see it? The check mark, the reverse Italy boot, whatever you want to see it, whatever you want to call it. I have other ones that I can see too. Do you see others? All right, so we've got, well, come on, you can't just call it a triangle. That's not any fun. All right, I like vulture head. Let's go with that. All right, so we've got vulture head on the left for red channel. We've got vulture head for green, and then we've got vulture head for blue as well. I'd also say that we've got little checkbox, little square, or if we want to be fun about it, we could call it retro robot face, whatever. But we've got retro robot face on the red, the green, and the blue. And the reason that I point out those three and look at that is those are in different ranges of the image. So we've got, what was this? Buzzard head? I forgot it already. That's what I get for picking a weird name. Vulture skull. Okay. You hybrid it with your own thing there. I saw what you did. All right. So vulture skull is falling down more in the upper shadow regions, which is typically going to be that 30 IRE kind of down is kind of your shadows in your image. We've got in the upper end of the midtones. So midtones, especially like skin tones on a normally exposed image. So not like something that's shot really low exposure for creative purposes, but a normal kind of image is typically your 40 to 60 IRE range. So it's nice to look for what could maybe be skin tone values to work with. And then we've got, so this is kind of like the upper end of that. And then we got stuff that's falling up into the highlights, which would be like this identifiable shape in the reds, the greens, and the blues. Only there's kind of one channel that's a little more out of whack. If you look at this, which channel doesn't align visually with the others? Yeah, I think blue's pretty obvious. And like, where is it off the most is kind of the question. Shadows are a little lower. This one's pretty noticeably off. The highlights are really noticeably off. So what you can do for a base correction is go in and use the RGB parade to kind of start out as a reference point if something looks a little bit off. So I kind of thought this image just to my eye looked a little bit too green, and that might be because of the lack of dominance in the blue channel. We could maybe bring some of that back just by putting some blue in the image. So I'll look at that. But before I get to color, I'm just going to start with the image itself because these guys pointed out right away, this looks a little just overexposed. So kind of order of operations. One, I look at exposure to start. So let's go in. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to pick Lumetri. And the fact is there's about 10 different ways to skin this exposure cat in here. As we can go in and literally adjust exposure in the basic correction tab. So, oh, well, it looks overexposed, but oh, wait a minute, that changes the whole image. This is great. I can see details start coming back in my paper, but it messes the whole image up. And tip, you can double click these and they go back to normal. So I want to have exposure control over all those areas. So I could go in and say, well, just bring my highlights back. And for this, it would work. I can pull out highlights and see what I can get back. And actually, it does a pretty good job. If you look, undo, just redo, there's enough detail in that image that I could pull it out of it. So the data was there. But if you want to look at them all kind of simultaneously, Premiere in Lumetri gives you a few other spots to do it. It's kind of goofy to me that they don't put it right at the top, because to me this is a primary thing, but whatever. Most editors are going to have a three-way color corrector in it. So you're going to find a three-way corrector, stock, and all sorts of stuff. After Effects has a good one too in it. It's called three-way color corrector. So I could go in, and what I like about this is I can work with midtone, shadows, and highlights. So if I want to take back some of the highlights, I'll just do it right within this and kind of see how far I want to go. I don't necessarily need to take it back that far, but I want to take it back enough that I can get some of the text, bring out some of the detail in the poster. Same thing with my shadows. Do I need something to be darker or go to black? And this one, I'd argue that I don't. In fact, maybe I want to see a little bit more detail under there. I can bring that out. My midtone level, which is really going to affect my walls too, because my walls kind of fall on that fringe. My walls looked a little bit bright. I think Taylor said the chair looked a little bit bright. I mean, the gray of that chair is going to be pretty close to a middle gray midtone. So maybe I'll pull back the mids a little bit and just kind of get this looking a bit more normal. And I'd say to my eye right now, this looks more normal. So here's where we started. Here's where we are. If I double click this clip, I can have it come up over in the timeline to kind of see the difference between the two, and the difference should be kind of mild right now, but there's a little bit of a difference. I think there we can see it. There's my base adjustment. So I'm just starting with exposure levels. Now I'm going to move to color. So what I'm going to do is put my scopes back on, and we'll kind of look at two different methods of doing that. All right. So I think I'll use the base correction tab next. This is the one that I think is tempting to grab and adjust, are the white balance and tone sliders. And the fact is, you can use 3-4 different areas of this, and you're affecting all the same things. They're independently useful at different times for doing different things, but I like to start out with curves when there's one color concerned, because these are kind of the additive secondaries. So you've got basically cyan on the far left of the top slider and magenta on the far right of the bottom one. Has been worked with curves at all in Photoshop? Who's used curves? All right, a chunk of the group. So if you're familiar with curves from Photoshop, same standpoint kind of applies. So let's go have a curves discussion real quick here and refresh the groups. The group. Now I've kind of reset this a little bit here, but now that I've pulled this down, you see where the disparity is? The disparity is more specifically at this spot where I see these blocks, more at my 50% IRE area. That's my midtone value. So I want to bring blues up in that. I'm going to work with the tone curve. Now, who wants a refresher on curves? Like, who's kind of unsure on curves in the group? I think that's a fair one. Everybody's a curve master. All right, let's give a curve refresh. How does curves work? Anybody want to jump on board on this one? See, I say everybody knows curves, but then if I ask somebody to talk about curves, nobody wants to talk about it. Come on now. Sammy. You drag it around and you've developed muscle memory. All right, well let's start there. So shadows is going to be the lower end of the curve. Midtones is in the middle. Highlights is over here. And then you can either bring out exposure essentially or take away exposure by where you push the curve. And if you push it too far, it can get weird and posterized, and you have a gray artifacting come into your image, so you got to be kind of careful with it. But let's take this as an example. Like if I wanted to add contrast to this image, do a classic contrast curve. Put a point in the highlights, put a point at the edge of the shadows, basically punch that highlight exposure up, and there you can see it kind of on the walls on the monitor. Pull that shadow detail down, and you're going to have basically a high contrast image just with a curve setup. So one quick adjustment. Now that's global. That's applying to, doesn't look like that normally. That's applying to the entire image. And we can just double click these to reset them. We're concerned about the blues right now. So I'm going to click the blue so I get just the blue curve. And as I mentioned, this midtone looks a little bit low, and I thought the wood kind of looked green. So I could just go into the midtone of this curve, pop it and pull it, and look what happens to the waveform. You see it come more in line? Now it's maybe not in line across the entire image. Like, all right, so I've hit just the midtone. Those squares have kind of come in line. But my, what do we call this one? Check mark, or was this inverse Italy boot? I can't remember. It's one or the other. Inverse Italy boot looks a little bit low in the highlights. So if I wanted to go in and technically kind of adjust, I could do the same thing here. I could go to my highlights and I can isolate areas of the curve. So if I want to pop the highlight blues up just a little bit more, if I go back, I can almost see some green and yellow in there. If I want to pop that up just a little bit more, to bring that up, if I can get it to go. Control me. Just stretching it, maybe not perfectly in line. Let's see the difference from where we started. Oh man, now this whole scene really looks yellow. All right, let me undo, redo. You see in the cast that we saw before now, or is it just me? I can really see it on my monitor. Exposure maybe go down a little bit. Sorry, this monitor looks so different than this one, but there's after I've added a little bit of blue back into the scene. Here's beforehand. You guys seeing the difference? Forehand, after. Now, I'd want to work with this till I kind of get this, looking correct the way that I want it to. But if I go down, my shadows are pretty well in line. I've pushed this up a bit more in line, but I don't have a huge amount of latitude with it, but I think I've brought some more of it back into it. I could maybe pull the exposure back a little bit after this. Go back and maybe pull my shadows back just a little bit because that was looking kind of goofy. We'll pull my midtones back a little bit too. All right. And I'm going to say that I've kind of got this close enough. Like this looks the way I want it to look from a base level. This would be a good example of essentially having an anchor ready. This is my anchor point. I'm going to base everything else around this now after that point. So let's jump back to the timeline. So again, kind of order of operations, started with exposure, then moved some base correction. And this one, I basically did everything just with a simple exposure adjust and one curve wheel adjust in the blue channel, or one curve line adjust in the blue channel. Let's see how this matches up with the next one. What's that? Oh, thank you. Recording video probably doesn't help it. There we go. All right, pretty drastic, huh? We've got that difference. All right, I'll give you a cool tool for doing color work. So the problem is, if I want to see how this looks right next to this, I can double click this clip and it's going to pop up. But there's a problem here. Do you see the difference? Left to right. What's the difference? What's going on? What are we seeing on the left? What are we seeing on the right? Yeah, the left is Bennett says the image without correction. It's the source image. So it's the source clip. It's this clip in my project window. The right has the correction on it. If I want to go through the timeline and grade these to match, essentially, I don't want to see that. I don't want to see the source image. So we got to work with the ref monitor. So has anyone explored and found the ref monitor in Premiere yet? Reference monitor. Super useful for this, for A/B comparisons in timeline. So we're going to window at the top and we're going to go to reference monitor. And what you're going to get is you're going to get a choice for whatever sequences you have. You can actually reference other sequences which can be really useful if you're working like in a different scene and you want to kind of color compare between that scene. If you've built them into multiple sequences, can be useful. But in this case, I'll choose white balance correct because that's the one that I set up. And when you go in, it might be default like this. It might be locked and ganged in. Mine has my last known state. So you notice as I scrub across the timeline, basically I'm getting a duplicate window of it. Well, it's not intended to just be a second window. It's intended to be isolatable. So if I go in on it and uncheck the gang to program monitor, now I can basically scrub through this like it's its own timeline. So check it out. There's the next cut. Let's go back to this. Now if I compare left to right, I've got my two base cuts together to start with. So this is a great starting point. And I'll do this one a little bit different. Here's my anchor. And again, I'd be going down the line. You guys might have 3-4 shots to cut together. I recommend get that anchor set, then go on to the other ones. So I'll go on to the other one on the right and grab it. And this one I'll do just a little bit different. So some people don't like the curves and like to just push stuff around visually. I like to know that this one's been fairly technically dialed in. It's kind of fixed up and looking the way that I want it to. Now I have some confidence, and I'll kind of trust it as a match versus an A-B comparison with my eyes. So I'm just going to push it cooler, but holy cow, that really makes the walls green. And because it's cyan, I have to counter it with maybe a magenta on the other side to try to get it as close as I can. And this is where those of us in the room that maybe have the golden eye ability can really dead on match this stuff. You know, some people are innately better at it than others. So go in and kind of blend this to get sort of close. And I might need to go in and kind of combine that with another base correction. Maybe I can go into my color wheels at the bottom and work with, you know, the midtones, how intense are those midtones or shadows or highlights to kind of try to match it and push it around. And I actually got a lot closer when I did this yesterday, so I kind of want to see if I can get there just with sliders a little bit to kind of do the same thing. Well, it's not close at all. So those highlights are a little bit too intense. All right. I'm not there yet, but am I getting closer? What do you guys think? Just pushing it around? I feel like the color in this shot, because it was so warm to begin with, it almost feels a little more saturated too. So I don't know if you see, like in the desk, I really see more greens in the wood grain of the desk than I see in the ref. Are you guys seeing that too? Is it just me? Same with the road on the poster up there. I can see a lot of that as well. So I'll kind of show you some other tools you can use. We probably won't get this perfect. The fact is, it's a combination of things. And you kind of got to have a tit-tat back and forth. But I'm going to go into curves and see if I can use a secondary curve. We use the RGB curve to start. This one's kind of fun. Hue saturation curve. I find this really, really useful for specifically this one in Premiere for like skin tones. If you shot it, maybe a camera with a really punchy profile, your color profile wasn't dialed in more neutral, and it looks just, you know, very saturated. It's kind of nice to be able to go in and control parts of images where you want saturation, where you don't. One of them would be like maybe like the greens in this. They look a little too intense because I'm seeing them, you know, showing up in there. I'm also seeing maybe the yellows in the wall looking a little bit more intense on this right one than the left one. So I'll go in and maybe just hit that whole range. What this is basically saturation or hypersaturation versus desaturation in the middle. So if I wanted to, just to show you overall with the image, you can grab the thing and I can basically pop up all the saturation in the image just working with the saturation curve, or I can take it all back and totally desaturate it. I'll undo. Or I can go in and isolate. So I could take like the yellows that kind of appear in the brick all the way through maybe some of the greens that I think are showing up in the table. And I can pick a range of those and say, well, how saturated do I necessarily want those tones to be. Now, I don't know that I have this right yet, but let's undo it and redo it. Am I seeing things, or are you guys noticing any difference? Minor? Let's push it extreme. Part of it, I think, is this monitor. Like, I can see it on mine. It helps to have a retina display in front of me, but I'm really pulling it back. And here, maybe I'll even just push the range more extreme. You can really see it across the range. To me, there, the whites and the bricks are getting closer to the one on the left. I don't think it's right yet, but let me see if we can undo that and really notice. Undo. There, I think you can totally see it. Redo. Undo. Is it so subtle that you guys aren't even noticing it, or is it just me? There, I did it. No effect, effect. No effect, effect. Can you see it at all? All right. On my monitor, I can very vividly see it. I think the color gamma of this screen is just a lot more sensitive than this one, is probably what I'm seeing. But I find that one really, really useful for, again, those isolated saturations there. How about that? Can you see that? Just messing with everything. But what I was able to do, and I don't know that this is perfect yet, because it's not, but sort of a different approach. Let me fit it. My anchor shot, my cut shot, I don't know that they're perfect yet, 100%, but I think they're, yeah, that one definitely looks yellower to me, the one I had over here. But they're getting there. They're closer. So it's going to take more tweaking. And, you know, even on this side, I probably end up jumping back over to that Lumetri scope and saying, well, just, you know, where is the balance, and like checking myself. It's like, oh, holy cow, I think the blue actually does look a bit too much. So maybe I would need to finish it off and go further with curves. Or you can even look at specific areas of the image. So I'll show you this one last spot, and then we'll, so like those highlights look a little much. Just pull them back. Oops. This is kind of fun. We're going to use this more next time, but specifically toning parts of images. So like if I needed maybe in my midtone to my highlight range to put a little yellow back into the walls, I can control where I want that to go. Like there's a little yellow back into the walls. My exposure's wrong, I think still, but does my cut color blend a little bit better? What do you guys think? Can really push it, since it doesn't seem to show so much on that monitor. Closer? I feel like I'm better now. No, I'm way worse. It's goofy looking. So kind of a lot of points of control. I guess I'll leave it there, because I would really need to tweak this, and looking back and forth between the two monitors is screwing me up. I think I got closer yesterday with my last group. This was my in-class tweak last session. This looks balanced a little bit better than what I had today. So, all right, that said, what we're going to do is we're going to leave it there. So we should have about an hour plus right now, about an hour. We're going to go over to the digital lab, and you guys are going to have the whole rest of the session to tweak your stuff. So the goal is by next time, you're going to have basically in your individual folder, you'll have my white balance correction sample corrected, and then you're going to have your cut corrected. And we're just looking for clip match. I'm not looking for wild, cool looks right now. Let's just get as consistent across the clips. Yeah, I always want an exported file, because it's a, yep, Premiere file, source footage, exported. We want all that so we can see it all. All right, pack up and let's head over there.